I'd been working as a park ranger for a few years now, and while I'd seen some strange things, animals acting out of character, odd noises in the dead of night, I never truly understood what it meant to be in real danger in the wilderness. The kind of danger that could shatter your sense of safety and make you question whether you really knew the forest at all. That all changed one fall evening, and it left me scarred, terrified, and haunted by what happened that night. It was late October, the air already crisp with the chill of autumn, and I was out on my usual patrol in the park. Most of the visitors had gone home, leaving behind only the few die-hard campers. The sky was darkening earlier than usual, and the trees were bare enough that the wind howled through them like distant voices. The kind of eerie, unsettling atmosphere that creeps up on you when you're alone in the woods. As I was driving along the park's narrow road, my headlights cutting through the thickening fog, I saw something strange. A shadow, no, figures, standing at the edge of the trail. My first instinct was to think they were other rangers or hikers out too late, but something didn't sit right. There was no movement, and they didn't seem to belong to the forest, as if they were standing just outside of time itself. I slowed down, pulling my truck off the side of the road, and reached for my radio to check in with the other rangers. The static filled the air, and then a voice crackled through. "Ranger 87, this is Ranger 44. What's your 20? I paused. Ranger 44 was stationed on the opposite side of the park. We didn't usually cross paths, and even if we did, the figure I saw didn't match the silhouette of anyone I knew. 44, you wouldn't be near the Ashford Trail, would you?" I asked, keeping my tone casual, though something deep inside me was beginning to feel unsettled. There was a long pause, so long it made my skin crawl. "No, 87, we haven't been anywhere near there tonight. Why?" I could hear the worry in Ranger 44's voice. That's when I knew something wasn't right. I had a bad feeling, like a warning, but I couldn't shake the thought that I might be overreacting. Maybe it was just the fog playing tricks on my mind. Just seeing things, I muttered to myself. Probably just a trick of the light. But as I stepped out of the truck to investigate, the figures were still there. They hadn't moved an inch, standing perfectly still, shrouded in shadows. The trees behind them seemed unnaturally dark, almost as if they were trying to hide whatever was standing there. I took a deep breath and started walking toward them. As I approached, I felt it, the hair on the back of my neck standing up, my pulse quickening. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. "Hey, is someone out there?" Nothing, no response. I stepped closer, my boots crunching against the cold ground. And then there was movement, but not the kind of movement I was expecting. They began to turn slowly, their faces still hidden in darkness. It wasn't just one person. It was a group, perhaps 6 or 7 of them, all standing there like they were waiting for something or someone. I felt a strange pull toward them, something unexplainable, like I had to keep moving forward. But as I neared them, I could feel it in the air. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in a thick fog, and the woods around me seemed to close in. The figures slowly turned to face me, their faces still shrouded in darkness, but I could hear them now, whispering. It wasn't a language I understood, but the tone was unmistakable, agonizing. It sounded like something old, something ancient, and it sent a chill through my spine. I reached for my flashlight, trying to steady my hand, and shined it at them. The light cut through the darkness, but it didn't seem to touch them. It was like the beam was being absorbed into the air, sucked into an invisible void. I froze, unable to move. My heart pounded in my chest, and my breathing became shallow. One of them stepped forward. I could feel their presence, even before they fully emerged from the shadows. The face that appeared before me was pale, gaunt, and hollow-eyed, with a mouth that opened in an unsettling smile. It wasn't human, at least not entirely. The creature's lips barely moved as it spoke, and its voice sounded like it came from deep beneath the earth. "Lost. Are we?" it whispered. My body refused to obey my mind. I wanted to run, I wanted to scream, but my legs felt like they were cemented to the ground. "Who are you?" I managed to croak out, my voice trembling. The creature tilted its head, eyes burning into mine. "We are the forgotten," it rasped, stepping even closer. "We walk where the living fear to tread. We are what haunts the park." Suddenly, I realized what it meant. These weren't people. They weren't even really ghosts, not in the way I thought I understood them. These were spirits of something ancient, something that had existed in these woods far before any ranger ever stepped foot here. A shiver ran down my spine, and as I tried to back away, I felt the air around me shift. The woods had turned silent, impossibly silent, as if every living thing had ceased to exist. The only sound was the whispering, the low, mournful voices growing louder, coming from all directions. I snapped my gaze around, but the figures were gone, vanished, like smoke in the wind. The fog had thickened even more, and I couldn't see more than a few feet in front of me. I stumbled back to my truck, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I threw the truck into reverse, spinning the tires as I tore away from that place, my heart still racing. I don't know how long I drove, but by the time I made it back to the ranger station, I was sweating, dizzy, and completely disoriented. The events from that night were hazy, like they happened in a dream. Something I wanted to forget, but couldn't. And the worst part? When I checked my radio and my logs the next day, there was nothing. No record of me making a call. No sign of any figures. It was like the entire night had been erased from reality. I tried to continue working. I tried to act like it was just another odd encounter in the woods, but the fear lingered. Every rustle in the trees, every gust of wind sent me into a panic. I'd hear those whispers, faintly, as if they were always just out of reach. And no matter how much I told myself it was just my imagination, deep down I knew that I had come face to face with something far older, far more dangerous than I could ever comprehend. Since that night, I've never gone back to the Ashford Trail. I can't. And every time I hear a rustle in the woods or feel the temperature suddenly drop, I wonder, are they still out there waiting? The park is beautiful, yes, but there's something else in those woods. Something that watches. And it remembers.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. Never had the slightest inkling that something beyond the living world could affect us, let alone torment us. But that all changed when I worked as a park ranger at Eagles Hollow National Park. I'd been hired in the spring, fresh out of college, eager to start my career in the great outdoors. The park was known for its sprawling forests, tranquil lakes, and steep, treacherous cliffs. It wasn't a heavily trafficked area, so it was often quiet, peaceful, even. But the tranquility always felt off, like there was something more beneath the surface. I didn't think much of it at the time. After all, I was surrounded by trees and animals, not ghosts or nightmares. At least, that's what I thought. It all started with the first night shift I worked at the park's old ranger station. The building was an ancient stone structure dating back to the 1930s, with the kind of creaky, eerie vibe that only old places have. The station wasn't far from the main entrance of the park, so I'd often have to go out on patrols after dusk, checking the trails, the lakes, and any campers who were out too late. On my first evening shift, it was uncomfortably quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making your own heartbeat sound too loud. The forest was bathed in the soft glow of moonlight, with long shadows stretching across the ground. My radio crackled with static every few minutes, but there was nothing on it, no calls, no updates. I started my rounds around 9 p.m., and at first, everything seemed fine. That was until I reached an area of the park known as Deadman's Hollow. The place had a reputation, and even though I hadn't heard many details, there were rumors about it being haunted. Old-timers would mutter things about strange lights seen in the woods, strange sounds that echoed through the trees at night, and some stories about park rangers who had gone missing on that trail. I'd brushed it all off as local superstition. But that night, as I approached the hollow, I felt it. The air seemed to thicken, like it had been filled with static electricity. The forest grew unnervingly silent. No insects, no owls hooting, no sounds at all. I parked my patrol vehicle at the edge of the hollow and stepped out. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as I felt the strange pull of the place. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, bouncing off tree trunks and dense underbrush. I began walking along the narrow trail, the beam dancing ahead of me. That's when I heard it, the soft, almost imperceptible whisper. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But the whisper came again, louder this time, as though someone was just beyond my sight, speaking in hushed tones. Help? I froze. My heart thudded in my chest. My instincts told me to turn back, but I couldn't. It was as if something was drawing me forward. The whispering continued, but now I could hear it more clearly. It wasn't just one voice. It was several. distant, overlapping, all crying out for help. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my pulse quickening. Hello? I called out, trying to sound steady, but my voice trembled. Is someone out there? No answer. Just the whispering growing louder, almost frantic. I stepped off the main path, shining my flashlight through the trees, my boots crunching over fallen leaves. The further I walked, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. A chill ran through my body, and I could see my breath forming in the cold air, though it wasn't particularly chilly that night. I didn't know it at the time, but it was the beginning of something that would haunt me forever. I finally came to a small clearing, and that's when I saw it, just for a moment, a figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but the shape was unmistakable, pale, thin, and standing at the edge of the clearing, facing away from me. The figure was motionless, like it was waiting for something. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. The whispering grew louder, more desperate. Help, please, come closer. I took a step forward, my mind racing. What was I doing? I should have run. I should have called it in, but my feet moved on their own, drawing me toward the figure. The closer I got, the more details I could make out. The figure had ragged clothing, like something from a different era, old boots, a weathered jacket, but there was something wrong with it, something that made my skin crawl. Its back was too long, its arms too thin, and the air around it seemed to shimmer with an unnatural cold. I stopped a few feet away and whispered, "Are you okay?" The figure slowly turned, its face pale and featureless. No eyes, no mouth, just a blank, smooth surface where a face should be. "Help me," it whispered again, its voice hollow and distant. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I turned and ran back down the trail. The whispering grew louder, but now it was a chorus of voices, overlapping, urgent. It was like they were all around me, but I couldn't see them. They were just there. I fumbled for my radio, hands shaking, trying to make contact with the ranger station, but all I could hear was static. I burst out of the woods, gasping for breath. I looked back, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, the darkness, the silence. The air was still again, but the feeling of being watched lingered, pressing against me, heavy and oppressive. I couldn't explain what happened. I knew what I saw, but it made no sense. When I got back to the station, I was a mess, trying to convince myself that I had just imagined it all. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was something in the air, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. I knew what I had seen. The next day, I went back to Deadman's Hollow. I had to know. But when I arrived at the clearing, there was nothing. No figure, no whispers, just the empty space, as though nothing had happened. I tried to shake it off. Maybe it was a hallucination, I told myself. Maybe the stress had gotten to me. But the feeling, that horrible, lingering feeling, never left. I couldn't shake it, no matter how hard I tried. Every time I worked the night shift, I'd hear whispers in the trees. I'd see flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye. But no one was ever there. Weeks passed. I tried to ignore it, bury it in the back of my mind, but it was always there. And then one night, something happened that made me realize that I wasn't just seeing things. I was working late again and patrolling the trails. It was just after midnight and I was near Deadman's Hollow again, this time farther down the path. The whispers were louder than ever, and the cold was unbearable, seeping into my bones. It felt like I was being drawn towards something. I couldn't resist. I walked deeper into the woods, past the old clearing, past the place where the figure had stood. But this time, I felt different. Something was watching me. I turned a corner in the path and froze. There, standing in front of me, was a figure, a man. His face was pale, his body thin, almost skeletal, and his eyes were wide, too wide, with a glassy, vacant stare. He wore the same old-fashioned clothes as the thing I had seen before. He didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me. And that's when I saw it, a faint, almost invisible line running from his chest to the trees, like a thread that connected him to something deeper in the woods. I didn't wait around to find out what. I turned and ran as fast as I could, the voices growing louder until they reached a deafening crescendo. I stumbled back to the ranger station, heart pounding, and locked the door behind me. But I knew, deep in my gut, that the park would never be the same. That place was cursed, haunted by something far older than any of us. And now, years later, I still hear the whispers. They're always there, waiting for me.
Next story.
I wasn't a rookie ranger when I took on the shift that night, but something about the air that evening made the woods feel different. It had been an ordinary day, even after I had been assigned to the old unused trail, the one we never talked about much. It was only after the sun dipped below the horizon that I realized why no one came around anymore. I checked in with the station, confirmed my route, and set off with a flashlight and a radio. It was standard protocol, though it felt as if I were walking into a forgotten part of the park, one that didn't want to be found. The first sign that something was wrong came when I noticed how dense the trees grew as I moved deeper into the trail. The light from my flashlight barely cut through the thick canopy above, casting odd shadows on the ground. The air was unnaturally still, devoid of the usual sounds of insects or birds that the forest typically offered in the early evening. The absence of life left me feeling exposed, like I was trespassing on something ancient. As I walked, the rustling of leaves began, not from the wind, but from something moving through the brush. My first thought was an animal, perhaps a deer or a raccoon. I stopped and listened closely, scanning the surroundings with my light, but saw nothing. A flicker of unease began to settle in my chest. I kept walking, trying to shake the feeling that something was watching me, though I couldn't pinpoint why. It wasn't long before I came across the first oddity. A small stone cairn placed carefully in the middle of the trail. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I had worked long enough to know that park rangers weren't to disturb the environment, and leaving behind unnatural objects like that wasn't common. It looked almost deliberate, the rocks stacked with precision as if it were meant to mark something important, something forbidden. I took a cautious step around the cairn, instinctively pulling my radio closer. I hadn't heard anything over the comms in a while, no chatter, no updates from the other rangers. It was as if the world outside the trail had disappeared. And then, just as I was about to move on, I heard a low voice. It wasn't clear at first, but as the words sharpened, I could make out the faint whisper. Help me. It was distant, barely audible, but the voice was unmistakable. It was a woman's voice. I froze, scanning the trees around me. There was no one in sight. I called out, unsure if I was speaking to the wind or something more. Hello? Is someone out there? For a long moment, silence followed, and then I heard it again. This time it was much clearer. The voice was stronger, tinged with desperation, like a cry for help. Please, help me. I followed the sound, my boots crunching against the forest floor. I didn't know what I expected. Maybe a lost hiker, someone who had wandered off the trail. But the further I walked, the more I realized the voice was coming from deeper within the woods, off the trail. My heart rate picked up, a combination of concern and the creeping realization that I not be alone. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush more tangled. It felt like I was walking into another world entirely, one that had swallowed the trail I had been following. There were no animal sounds now, just the occasional flutter of branches above me. It was like the forest was holding its breath. I reached an opening where the trees seemed to bend inwards, as though forming a natural arch. The moonlight barely reached the ground here, but enough filtered through to reveal the figure standing in the center. She was dressed in tattered clothing, her face pale as though drained of life, her eyes wide and empty. For a moment, I thought she was just a hallucination, some trick of the light or my overactive imagination. But as I blinked, the figure didn't disappear. She was real, standing motionless in front of me. Are you okay? I asked, my voice faltering as the words left my mouth. The woman didn't respond immediately. She only tilted her head slightly, as though listening to something beyond me. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, and the words sent a chill down my spine. Don't trust the trees. I took a step back. What do you mean? Are you lost? But she didn't answer. Instead, she slowly turned away from me, her movements unnaturally stiff and jerky, as if she was being pulled by invisible strings. I instinctively took another step backward, the hairs on the back of my neck prickling with a sense of dread I couldn't explain. She stopped, her back still to me, and said one last thing before disappearing deeper into the trees. You shouldn't have come here. I was about to call out again when something in the darkness shifted. A low, rumbling sound came from the trees around me. No, not from the trees, but from beneath the ground. The earth trembled ever so slightly, and I felt a deep, unnatural vibration underneath my feet. Something was alive beneath the forest floor. I turned to run, but the trail behind me was now completely obscured by the thick underbrush. I had lost my way. Panic clawed at my chest. I reached for my radio, but there was no signal. No one could hear me. I moved quickly, my flashlight slicing through the dark, but the trees seemed to twist and distort in ways they shouldn't have. I was lost, or worse, trapped in something far older than I realized. I could feel it now. The forest itself was alive, as though it was moving, pulsing around me. And then in the distance, I saw it. The woman. No, it wasn't her anymore. She had been replaced by something darker, something more sinister. The figure had grown larger, twisted, its limbs unnaturally elongated. Its face was a mass of shadows, the eyes hollow and vacant, staring straight at me as it loomed through the trees. I turned and ran again, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The presence behind me seemed to grow stronger with every step. The trees closed in tighter, their branches twisting like hands trying to grab hold of me. I finally burst into a clearing, gasping for breath, and that's when I saw the cairn again, the one I had passed earlier. But this time, it wasn't just a pile of stones. The stones were arranged in a circle with symbols etched into them, symbols that looked too familiar, too ancient. I didn't understand them, but I knew they weren't meant to be disturbed. I heard the voice again, closer this time, whispering in my ear, "You're too late." I didn't wait to find out what that meant. I bolted, my mind screaming at me to keep running. I didn't stop until I reached the ranger station, breathless, my body covered in a cold sweat. I made my report, but when I tried to explain what had happened, my words felt hollow. I couldn't make sense of it, and neither could they. The older rangers just gave me knowing glances, as if they understood exactly what had happened. They didn't say it out loud, but their eyes told the story. I was not the first to encounter the things in the woods, and I wouldn't be the last. That night, as I lay in my cabin, I heard the whisper again. Faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Don't trust the trees." I knew then that the forest had its secrets, and some things, once you disturb them, don't ever let go.
Next story.
I had always thought that working as a park ranger would be peaceful, a quiet life spent in nature. I'd grown up in the city, and the idea of being surrounded by the forest was a welcome escape from the noise and rush of everyday life. But that all changed the day I arrived at Buckthorn Ridge. No one had warned me about the strange occurrences there. Maybe they didn't believe them themselves, or maybe they just didn't want to scare me. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It was a silence unlike any I had ever experienced. The forest was usually full of sounds, the rustling of leaves, the call of birds, the chirp of insects. But here it was almost completely still, like something had pressed a button and shut down all the life around me. I thought it was odd, but at the time, I chalked it up to being an isolated part of the park. I was stationed alone, and that evening I was doing my routine patrol, checking the perimeter, making sure the trail markers were intact, and keeping an eye on the campgrounds. It wasn't until I came across an old ranger's cabin deep in the woods that I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't on any of the maps I had, and I had never seen any mention of it in any of the files I reviewed. The cabin stood at the edge of a clearing, almost hidden behind thick trees, as though it had been deliberately placed out of sight. The windows were dark, and the roof sagged slightly under the weight of the moss growing on it. It looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there in years. I should have turned around and kept going, but curiosity got the better of me. I walked up to the door and knocked, though I knew no one would answer. The door creaked as I pushed it open. The interior was dusty, cobwebs hanging from the rafters. But there was something else, something wrong about the place. A faint, lingering smell of something that couldn't quite be identified. It was the kind of smell that would make your stomach churn if you thought about it too long. I walked further in, the floorboards groaning under my boots. The place was empty, save for a few old pieces of furniture, a rusted stove, and a shelf cluttered with old papers and notebooks. The notebooks were what caught my attention. They were stacked neatly on a table near the back of the room, each one yellowed with age. I picked one up, flipping through the pages. The handwriting was frantic, scattered. Some pages were torn or smudged, but the message was clear. The previous ranger, whose name I later learned was Daryl, had been obsessed with something. He had written about hearing strange noises at night, soft, whispering voices that came from deep within the forest. He spoke of a presence, something ancient and powerful that had lived in these woods long before human settlers had arrived. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, the loneliness of the job getting to him. But as time went on, the noises grew louder. The whispers began to call his name. Reading Daryl's notes sent a cold chill up my spine. He wrote about seeing things too, figures that moved just outside his sight, fleeting shadows, whispers that echoed in the wind. The worst part was when he described hearing footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps following him wherever he went. I could feel my heartbeat quicken as I read on. The final entry in the notebook was short and simple, but it struck me to my core. It's here. It's watching me. I can feel it in my bones. It won't leave me alone. I felt like I was being watched as I read those words. I shut the notebook and quickly shoved it back into its place on the shelf. I needed to get out of there. I left the cabin, the door slamming shut behind me. The air outside felt thick, oppressive. The silence had returned, but it wasn't the peaceful kind anymore. It was as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I tried to push the feeling aside, but it stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. I went back to my truck, but when I tried to start it, the engine sputtered and died. I couldn't believe it. This wasn't the first time I had seen cars break down in the park, but something about this felt different. My radio was dead too. I had no cell service and the light was beginning to fade, the sun sinking below the horizon. I checked my watch, 6:30 p.m. I needed to head back before it got too dark, but every step I took away from the cabin felt wrong. It was like I was walking in someone else's footsteps, as if the ground beneath me was unsettled, shifting. The trees seemed to lean in closer, blocking the trail. The air felt thicker with each breath I took, and I could hear faint rustling sounds from the underbrush, like something was moving through the leaves just behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It was barely audible, just the softest breath of sound, but I could make out words. My name. Daryl. Daryl. I froze. I thought I was imagining things, but the voice came again, clearer this time. Daryl, it's too late. I didn't know who was calling me. Was it a lost camper? Was it a prank? No, it couldn't be. The voice sounded too familiar, too close, and it was unmistakably not human. I quickened my pace, trying to ignore the voice that seemed to echo in my ears, growing louder with each step. The whispers turned into murmurs, and the murmurs turned into screams. Suddenly I felt it, a hand, cold and clammy, grip my shoulder. My heart jumped into my throat as I spun around, my flashlight flicking on, but there was no one there. No person. No creature. Just the heavy, unnatural silence. I could hear footsteps now, heavy ones dragging through the dirt just behind me. Someone or something was following me. I didn't look back this time. I just ran. My boots hit the ground hard, my chest tightening as I pushed myself faster. I could hear it getting closer. The footsteps. The breathing. I finally made it back to the ranger station, my heart pounding in my ears. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, gasping for breath. The radio crackled to life, startling me. Ranger 12, you there? The voice came through clear, but it wasn't one I recognized. I grabbed the mic, my hands trembling. Yeah, I'm here. What's going on? The voice on the other end paused. We've been trying to reach you all day. Did you check in on Buckthorn Ridge? I hesitated, staring at the door, still shaking. I just came back from there, I said, my voice shaky. There's something out there. I don't know what it is, but I think it's dangerous. The voice on the radio was calm, almost too calm. You need to leave now. That place isn't what you think it is. Whatever's there, it won't let you leave. It was then that I understood. The last ranger who had worked Buckthorn Ridge hadn't disappeared by accident. And whatever was out there, whatever it was that had haunted the forest for years, had claimed them, just as it would claim anyone who dared to step too close. I stayed in the ranger station that night, waiting for daylight to break. I never went back to Buckthorn Ridge. The stories they tell about that place are true. The park may look calm during the day, but when the sun goes down, something dark and ancient stirs in the shadows. If you're ever out in those woods and you hear a whisper calling your name, don't follow it, because it's not a voice you want to meet.
Next story.
I'd been a park ranger for almost 5 years, but I'd never seen anything like this. The ranger station where I worked, Pine Creek National Park, was tucked away in a remote part of the forest, a place few people visited. The kind of park where the silence was so deep, it almost felt like the trees were holding their breath. I loved it there. Peaceful, quiet, and far from the distractions of modern life. But peace, as I would soon learn, could be deceiving. It all started with a routine maintenance job. The park had a system of old wooden cabins that were used by campers, and every few months we had to go in and check them for any damage, wildlife nests, or anything else that could pose a danger. It was just a part of the job. Most of the cabins were tucked deep in the woods, far from the main trail. That day, I was assigned to check on cabin 14. It had been empty for a while, which was unusual. The cabins were normally booked months in advance, especially during the warmer months. I didn't think much of it, just another lonely cabin in the woods. When I arrived, the place seemed to be in better shape than I expected. The cabin was small, nestled at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense trees. There were no signs of damage, and the porch was clean. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. It was stuffy and musty, as cabins often are after being closed for a while. The air felt thick, almost like it had been holding something in for too long. I flipped the lights on, and the cabin illuminated with a dull yellow glow, the shadows in the corners dancing like they had a mind of their own. I started my inspection, checking the windows and making sure the fireplace was clear of debris. But as I made my way to the back bedroom, something caught my eye. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peeking through. Curious, I pushed it open, and that's when I felt it. The temperature dropped. It was like stepping into an entirely different atmosphere, chilled, damp, and unnatural. The room itself was bare except for an old wooden bed, a chair, and a small wardrobe. But it wasn't the room that made my skin crawl. It was the bed. There, on the mattress, was something out of place. A single, dusty journal. I had no idea why, but I felt compelled to pick it up. It was old. The pages yellowed with age, and the leather cover cracked and faded. I opened it, and the first few pages were filled with what looked like notes or journal entries. But the further I read, the more unsettling it became. The writing wasn't just erratic, it was frantic, like the person who wrote it was losing their mind. They're here, watching, waiting. I can hear them at night, breathing, in the trees, in the walls. I've seen their eyes. They don't blink, don't look at them. It got worse the deeper I read. The words blurred together like the person who had written this had been trying to warn someone who might be in danger. The last entry was the worst. Don't go into the woods at night. If you hear them calling your name, don't answer. They will come for you. I slammed the book shut, my heart pounding in my chest. What was this? Why was it here? And why was it so specific? I'd been a ranger long enough to know that things could sometimes get strange in the woods. But this felt different. I left the cabin as quickly as I could, trying to shake the feeling of being watched. I should have gone straight back to the station and reported the journal, but something kept nagging at me. I had to know more. I returned the next day, intending to investigate the area around the cabin. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the forest floor as I walked the path that led from the cabin to the edge of the woods. The trail was narrow, surrounded by dense trees and underbrush, the kind of place where you'd expect to see wildlife, but never anything out of the ordinary. That's when I saw it, a figure. At first, I thought it was a person, someone who had wandered too far off the trail, maybe a lost hiker. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there facing away from me. And they were so still, too still. I called out, "Hey, are you all right?" There was no response. I took a few more steps toward the figure, but I stopped when I noticed something strange. There was no sound in the forest, no birds chirping, no wind, just the eerie, suffocating silence. I took another step, and then the figure turned. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even human. The figure's face was pale, too pale, its features distorted, like someone had taken a human face and twisted it. The eyes were too large, black pools that seemed to swallow all the light around them. Its mouth was wide, impossibly so, stretching into a grin that never ended. Before I could react, it let out a low, guttural growl, one that made my blood freeze in my veins. I backed away slowly, my hand reaching for my radio, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The thing just stood there, watching me, its grin never faltering. Leave. The forest. It rasped, the words scraping out like they didn't belong in our world. The voice was distorted, inhuman, filled with malice. I turned and ran. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, my chest heaving, my mind racing. I told my supervisor, Tom, what happened, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. It's just your imagination, he said. The woods play tricks on people, especially when they're alone. But I knew what I saw. I knew what I heard. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the journal and the figure in the woods. I knew I couldn't leave it alone. Not now. So I did some digging. I found out that years ago, back before the park was established, the area had been home to a small settlement. A family lived there, and rumors had circulated that they practiced some sort of dark, forbidden rituals. People said they had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind their homes, and some even claimed the land had become cursed. But the most chilling thing I discovered was that Cabin 14 had once been theirs. I went back the next day, determined to find more answers, to uncover the truth. I didn't tell anyone, Tom or the others. I couldn't risk anyone thinking I was losing my mind. I had to figure this out alone. As I entered the clearing where Cabin 14 stood, I felt that same sense of dread wash over me. The temperature seemed to drop, the air heavy with something unseen. I walked toward the cabin, but something stopped me, something in the woods. I heard it again, the voice. Get out. It was louder this time, sharper, as if it was right behind me. I turned, and there, standing at the edge of the trees, was the figure again. Watching. I bolted. I didn't care about the cabin. I didn't care about the answers anymore. All I cared about was getting out of that place. When I finally made it back to the station, I packed my things. I couldn't stay there any longer. Pine Creek was beautiful, but the forest held something dark, something ancient, something that wasn't willing to let go. I never returned to Pine Creek National Park. I left, and I haven't looked back. But sometimes late at night, I hear it again. That voice, that growl, the warning to leave the forest. And I can't shake the feeling that something is still watching me, waiting for the right moment to come out of the woods.
Next story.
It was a Saturday evening, the kind of night that made the park feel isolated, especially when the sun set behind the mountains. I'd been a park ranger for years, but there was something about the Black Oak Trail that always unsettled me. I had been warned by other rangers not to go out there after dark, but I'd always brushed it off. People love to tell scary stories about the woods, right? Ghosts, shadows, things that go bump in the night. Just superstition. But that night was different. I'd been assigned to do a late-night patrol, and naturally I headed toward Black Oak. The moon was barely visible, and the sky was thick with clouds, casting the forest in an eerie darkness. The trail was long and winding, and I'd only been out there a few times before, always in daylight. Tonight, the forest seemed to breathe with the wind, alive and watching. The trees whispered, their branches creaking as if they were trying to speak. I checked my flashlight, ensuring it was working, before stepping onto the trail. The crunch of my boots against the leaves was the only sound I could hear. The wind had died down, leaving an unsettling stillness. Then I heard it, faint at first, like a whisper. A voice carried on the wind. Help me. The voice was broken, pleading. I froze, straining to listen. There was no one around. The forest was silent once again, save for the sounds of the trees swaying. My heart raced, but I shook my head. It must have been the wind. It had to be. Still, I walked faster, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. As I pressed deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching me. My flashlight flickered, then went out. I cursed under my breath, banging it against my palm. Nothing. I was about to turn back when I heard the voice again, clearer this time. Help me. I can't find my way out. I snapped my head around, scanning the shadows. That voice sounded real. Panicked. I couldn't ignore it. Maybe it was a lost hiker, someone who had wandered off the path. I wasn't about to let anyone suffer out here. I shouted into the darkness, "Is someone out there? I'm a park ranger. Where are you?" The only response was silence. But then, faintly, just beyond my reach, there was movement. A shadow darting between the trees. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called again. my voice shaky. Who's there? Are you okay? Nothing. The shadow had disappeared, leaving only the stillness of the forest in its wake. I took a cautious step forward, the forest feeling more oppressive with each passing second. The air was thick, and I felt a strange coldness seeping into my bones. I tried to focus on the task at hand, telling myself that I was just spooked by the dark. But then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Lying in the middle of the trail, just ahead of me, was a hat. It was a dark green ranger's hat, the kind we all wear. I froze. The hat looked like it had been dropped in a hurry, the brim bent as if someone had been in a rush. I stepped forward and crouched down, my hands trembling as I picked it up. It didn't belong to me. It didn't belong to anyone I knew. Suddenly, the air seemed to grow heavier. The trees loomed like giants around me, and the forest felt like it was closing in. Then I heard the whisper again. Help me. This time, it wasn't just the wind. It was closer, much closer, almost right beside me. I spun around, my eyes darting through the darkness, but there was nothing. The forest had gone deathly quiet again. But then I saw her. A figure emerged from the darkness, moving slowly toward me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but then it became clearer. A woman, dressed in ragged clothes, her face pale, her eyes wide with terror. Her hair was wild, matted with dirt, and her hands were outstretched as though reaching for something, or someone. Please, help me, she whispered again, her voice a broken sob. I took a step back, unsure of what to do. There was something wrong with her, something unnatural. Her eyes were wide, but there was no recognition in them, just a vacant, hollow stare. She didn't seem real. I could almost feel the chill emanating from her as she drew nearer. Who are you? I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The woman's lips trembled as she opened her mouth, but the words that came out were not hers. They were a distorted, guttural sound like someone trying to speak through a layer of fog. Leave this place, she said, her voice growing more desperate. Leave before it's too late. I didn't know what to do. My mind was racing. This had to be some sort of trick, some cruel prank. But I couldn't ignore the fear that gripped my chest, the way the forest seemed to pulse with the weight of her words. I reached for my radio, but before I could get a word out, the woman let out a sharp, unearthly scream. The sound pierced through the night, sending a jolt of terror straight to my core. I dropped the radio, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. She lunged at me. I barely managed to dodge her, the icy fingers of her hand grazing my arm as I scrambled to my feet. Her scream echoed in the trees, a sound that felt like it was tearing through the very fabric of reality. I ran. I didn't stop to look back. I couldn't. The forest had come alive with sound. Branches creaked, the wind howled, and her voice, that horrifying scream, seemed to follow me with every step. It was as if the very woods themselves were alive with her, chasing me, drawing me deeper into their twisted depths. I sprinted down the trail, my breath ragged, my mind a blur. The trees seemed to bend toward me, their branches like arms reaching out to grab me, to pull me into the darkness. I could hear her voice in the wind, whispering, calling out, "Help me." When I finally burst back into the clearing near the ranger station, I was drenched in sweat, gasping for air. My flashlight flickered back to life, the beam cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of the woman. The trail was empty, silent. It was as if she had never been there. I stumbled back to the station, still shaking, my heart still racing. When I walked inside, my fellow rangers looked up at me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with concern. I couldn't speak at first. I didn't know how to explain what had just happened. Bill, the older ranger who had worked here for decades, looked at me gravely. "You saw her, didn't you?" I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Who was she? What happened to her?" Bill sighed and sat down. "She was one of us, a ranger who disappeared out there years ago. They said she was the victim of some accident, but people who know the woods say different. They say she never left, that her spirit is trapped in those trees, calling out to anyone who dares to walk the trail." "But why?" "Some things in these woods don't let go," Bill muttered. "Some things want you to stay forever." I left the park the next day, unable to shake the feeling that something was still out there, something waiting in the dark.
Next story.
I had been a park ranger for almost 5 years when I got the call that would haunt me forever. It was late, nearly midnight, when I received a routine dispatch to check on a secluded area of the park called Widow's Hollow. The area was known for its dense, foggy mornings and the strange myths that surrounded it. Local hikers avoided it, and my fellow rangers seemed to skirt the place whenever possible. But the call came through, and as always, I responded. I didn't think much of it at first. It was just another part of my shift. The hollow was known for being quiet, almost unnaturally so, and there was nothing about it that had ever seemed dangerous, at least not during the day. But tonight was different. A thick fog had rolled in around the time I entered the trail leading into the hollow, and even the air felt strange, like it had turned cold with something unseen. I pushed it out of my mind. This was just a quiet part of the park, and I was there to check the perimeter. I wasn't there to listen to old stories or believe in the rumors that said the place was cursed. The fog twisted around me, low and thick, almost like a living thing. My flashlight barely cut through it. I made my way down the trail, listening to the soft crunch of gravel beneath my boots. The path was eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no animals, not even the chirping of crickets. Just silence, so deep that it seemed unnatural. Every now and then, I could hear the occasional snap of a twig, but I chalked it up to my imagination. It wasn't until I reached the clearing near the old decaying bridge that things began to take a turn. The bridge was rickety, built decades ago, and no longer in use. It was just a remnant of a time long past when travelers might have crossed through here on foot, but now it was mostly ignored by the public. As I approached it, I noticed something odd. At the far end of the bridge, standing just before the thick trees, was a figure. It was tall, humanoid, but there was something strange about the way it stood. The fog swirled around it like it belonged to the mist itself. I froze, my hand instinctively reaching for my radio. But when I looked down at it, I realized the screen was blank. No signal. I shook my head. I was being paranoid. Maybe it was a hiker, or someone who had gotten lost, though that didn't make much sense given the hour. It was late, far past sunset, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there, eerily still. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the silence. "Are you lost?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't even acknowledge me. It stood motionless, its form barely visible through the fog. I took a cautious step forward, my flashlight flickering as if it were being swallowed by the dense mist. But before I could take another step, the figure slowly began to turn. Its movement was stiff, unnatural. And then, for a brief moment, I saw its face. It was pale, with hollow eyes and a twisted, skeletal grin. The face wasn't human, not fully. It was like a mask, something stretched too tightly over a skull. A grotesque mockery of a person. My heart skipped a beat, and I stumbled backward. Before I could react, the figure was gone. Just like that, it had vanished into the fog, as if it had never been there at all. I was left standing, trembling, in the middle of the hollow, my flashlight now completely dead. I was alone, or at least, I thought I was. The silence around me thickened. I glanced around, trying to make sense of what I had seen. My breath came in ragged bursts, and every sense screamed at me to leave. I turned, and my foot caught on something. I stumbled, catching myself on the edge of the bridge. When I looked down, I saw that I had tripped on a rusted chain that had been loosely tied around the old wooden posts of the bridge. It looked strange, out of place, like it had been there for years but never noticed. Curious, I knelt down to inspect it. That's when I saw the markings. Carved into the wood of the bridge, just under where the chain was tied, was a name. It was faded and chipped from age, but it was still legible. Lily Mercer. I felt a chill run down my spine. That name, it sounded familiar. I couldn't place where I had heard it before, but it nagged at the back of my mind. I shook off the feeling, trying to rationalize it. I checked my radio again. Still nothing. My flashlight flickered back to life, and I took a deep breath, deciding that it was time to head back to the ranger station. As I turned around, the fog seemed to thicken, becoming denser than before. It was almost suffocating. The shadows of the trees now looked like they were creeping toward me, leaning over the path as though trying to box me in. Then I heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible, coming from somewhere in the fog. "Help me." It was the voice of a woman. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but there was nothing, no one there. The only thing I could see was the mist, thick and swirling around me like it was alive. "Lily?" I called out, suddenly realizing what it was that had unsettled me. The name on the bridge, the face of the figure, it all started to piece together. Lily Mercer, the woman who had disappeared in the park years ago. She had been the daughter of a local family, a young woman who had been lost on a trail similar to the one I was on. Her body was never found, and the case went cold. There were whispers that she was taken by something in the woods, but no one ever truly believed it. Until now. Help me. The voice came again, clearer this time, and I felt my heart pound in my chest. It wasn't just a whisper anymore. It was right behind me, as though it were standing just over my shoulder. I turned around sharply, my flashlight illuminating the fog in front of me. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dense mist. But then, just beyond the beam of light, I saw a figure. Lily. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken, and her hands were outstretched toward me, as if begging for help. But her smile, it wasn't right. It was stretched too wide, a grotesque, twisted expression that seemed to mock me. I stepped back in shock, my body frozen. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure of Lily took a slow step forward, her eyes locked onto mine, and the air around me turned icy cold. The voice, now louder, whispered again, "Help me." And just as quickly as she had appeared, she vanished into the fog. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move, to think, or to breathe. I had no idea what I had just witnessed, but I knew one thing for sure. Something was not right in Widow's Hollow. I turned and fled. I didn't stop running until I reached the ranger station, where I told my supervisor everything I had seen. But when I asked about Lily Mercer, I was met with strange looks. No one had heard of her. I didn't go back to Widow's Hollow. Not after that night. The fog still rolls in every evening, and sometimes when I'm alone in the forest, I can hear a soft whisper carried by the wind. Help me.
Next story.
It was late October, and I had just started my job as a park ranger in the Appalachian National Park. I'd always loved nature, the woods, and the feeling of solitude the mountains provided. But something about that park didn't sit right with me from the moment I got there. The locals would tell stories, but I chalked them up to superstition. People love to talk about ghosts in places like this, especially in remote areas. I was skeptical, but everything changed one fateful night. It was an unusually cold evening for the time of year, and I was patrolling the far side of the park, an area rarely visited by tourists. I'd been warned by some of the older rangers not to wander too far off the beaten path, but I hadn't paid much attention to the warnings. As I made my way through the winding trails, a sense of unease began creeping in. The wind howled through the trees, the ground slick with recent rain. The forest was eerily quiet. Too quiet. I shrugged it off as just the chill of the night setting in. But then I heard it. A faint, distant voice, almost like a whisper, but not quite. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone calling my name, soft, pleading. "Jamie? Jamie?" The voice faded just as quickly as it had appeared. My heart raced. I turned around, but there was nothing, just the endless stretch of trees swaying gently in the breeze. I called out, "Hello? Is someone out there?" No reply. My flashlight flickered as if the batteries were drained. I checked them, but they were fine. A sense of dread hung in the air, thick and heavy. There was something wrong here, something off, but I couldn't bring myself to turn back just yet. I pushed forward, trying to shake off the eerie feeling, convincing myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my mind. But as I continued down the trail, I started to notice something. The trees seemed to close in on me, their twisted, gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. It was as if they were guiding me deeper into the woods, into something I didn't want to find. I was about to turn back when I heard the voice again. This time it was louder, clearer. "Jamie?" There was a crackling sound, like static, mixed with the voice. It sounded desperate now, as though whoever or whatever was calling was in pain. I froze. My skin prickled, and I could feel my breath catch in my throat. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaky. The silence that followed was suffocating. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I saw it. Through the trees, barely visible in the dim light, a figure appeared. It was tall, thin, and covered in tattered clothes. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. It stood still for a moment, then began to walk slowly toward me. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but I could feel its gaze on me. A cold, unsettling presence. I stumbled backward, heart hammering in my chest. What do you want?" The figure didn't respond, it just kept coming closer. I turned to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, trapped in the fear that had gripped me. Suddenly, the wind picked up, howling through the trees. The figure was only a few feet away now, its face still hidden in the shadows. It reached out toward me with long, skeletal hands, fingers like claws. I gasped, stepping back, but I tripped over a root and fell to the ground, scrambling to get away. As I looked up, the figure loomed over me, its face now visible in the dim light. It was a woman, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce straight through me. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Then she reached out, touching my arm with cold, bony fingers. A flash of images flooded my mind. I saw a woman, much like the one standing before me, running through the forest, eyes wide with terror. Her breath came in frantic gasps as she stumbled over rocks and roots. And then, in a sudden flash, I saw her fall, trapped, helpless, before darkness consumed her. The woman's terrified eyes stared back at me, pleading for help. But there was nothing I could do. She was gone, lost to the forest. The vision faded as quickly as it came, and I was left shaking, still staring up at the ghostly figure. It was silent for a moment, just standing there, as if waiting for something. Then it began to move again, slowly, deliberately. I scrambled to my feet, finally able to move, but I couldn't bring myself to run. My legs felt like jelly, and I was terrified that if I turned my back, it would be the last mistake I made. The woman stopped a few feet away, her hollow eyes still fixed on me. "Leave this place," she whispered, her voice barely audible, like the wind itself. "The forest doesn't forget." Her voice was so soft, but it carried a weight of sorrow that seemed to echo in my chest. The cold seeped deeper into my bones, and the air felt thick with dread. Before I could respond, she began to fade into the shadows, her form dissolving like mist. The only thing left was the whisper of her words hanging in the air, lingering like a warning. I didn't wait to see if she would return. I turned and ran, faster than I had ever run in my life. The trail twisted and turned, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. The forest felt alive now, alive with the memories of those lost in its depths. When I finally reached the ranger station, my chest was heaving, my mind a whirl of fear and confusion. I couldn't shake the image of her face, the woman who had died in these woods, who had never left. I told my fellow rangers what had happened, but they just stared at me in silence. I could see in their eyes that they knew exactly what I was talking about. They didn't question me, didn't dismiss it, they just nodded, as if it was an old, familiar story. One of them, an older ranger named Bill, finally spoke up. "You saw her, didn't you?" I nodded, still shaking. "Who was she?" Bill sighed, looking out the window toward the forest. "That's a long story. You'll learn about her eventually, if you stick around long enough. Some things in these woods, they don't go away. People like her, they're just lost, trapped between this world and the next. And if you're not careful, you might end up like her." I didn't stay much longer after that night. The park wasn't the same to me anymore. Every creaking tree, every whisper in the wind, it all seemed like a reminder of the thing I had seen, the thing I couldn't forget. The forest, with all its beauty, held something dark within it, and it was always watching, waiting for the next soul to get lost. But the hardest part was the feeling that I wasn't the first. The others who came before me, the ones who heard the whispers, the ones who vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Could it be that the forest had claimed them? And would it claim me too if I stayed long enough? As I left that night, I heard her voice once more. "Leave, leave, or be forgotten." I never went back.
Next story.
I'd always wanted to be a park ranger ever since I was a kid. The idea of spending my days surrounded by the vastness of nature, protecting the land, and helping people connect with the beauty of the wild seemed like a dream job. So when I finally landed a position at Timber Ridge National Park, I was over the moon. Little did I know that this job would soon unravel everything I thought I knew about reality. It started out just like I expected. Long hikes, working with a small but tight-knit team, guiding visitors and making sure the park stayed pristine. Timber Ridge was known for its incredible mountain views, crystal clear lakes, and thick forests that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of place where you could get lost in the beauty and the silence. But the silence wasn't always peaceful. There were nights I'd find myself walking the trails in the dark, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick woods. I'd been given the graveyard shift, to patrol one night, a regular occurrence for new hires, just to see how well we could handle ourselves out in the woods alone. That night was different, though. It had been a particularly eerie day. A cold front moving in, and the usual hum of crickets and night animals was unnervingly absent. The air felt still, stagnant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I was making my rounds by the old campground at the edge of the forest when I noticed something strange. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. There, by the edge of the trees, was a flicker, just a glimmer of movement. I stopped, scanning the area, but nothing moved. Maybe it was just a deer or a stray animal, I thought. I tried to convince myself it wasn't anything sinister. But when I heard the first scream, I froze. It wasn't the scream of a person. It was higher pitched, almost animalistic. It echoed through the trees, a chilling, guttural sound that sent ice through my veins. I immediately reached for my radio, trying to make contact with the others, but the radio was dead, static. I hesitated for a moment, torn between staying put and going toward the noise. But my duty as a ranger kicked in, and against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and started toward the sound. The scream came again, louder this time. But it wasn't coming from the direction I'd expected. It was closer, but still distant, as if it was bouncing off the trees. Something was wrong. The closer I got to the sound, the more twisted it seemed. It no longer sounded like a creature. It sounded like someone was in pain, like they were trapped and screaming for help, but their voice was distorted. I had to get to them. I finally reached the edge of a dense thicket and stopped in my tracks. There, just a few feet away, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure standing in the middle of the clearing. At first, it appeared to be a person, hunched over with their hands on their knees. But something about the way they moved made my stomach churn. They were shaking violently, their body contorting unnaturally as though they were in the middle of some twisted ritual or torment. Their head jerked up and I saw nothing. Their face was a smooth, pale mass, void of any features. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. My flashlight wavered in my hand and I almost dropped it when the thing turned toward me. There was nothing human about it anymore. The figure straightened up, its movements jerky and human. Its head snapped around, making a sound that shouldn't have been possible for a human neck. I could hear the leaves rustling as it moved, but it didn't walk. It glided, hovering just above the ground, its arms hanging limply at its sides. Before I could react, it let out another scream, this one louder, sharper, like nails scraping down a chalkboard. The ground beneath me trembled as if the very earth was recoiling from the thing. I had to get out of there. But my legs felt like lead. I turned, trying to force my body to move, but before I could take a step, the air around me went cold. A freezing gust of wind hit me, though there hadn't been any wind moments before. I spun back around, and the figure was gone. I searched frantically with my flashlight, but there was no trace of it. The clearing was empty, quiet once again. The only sound was my ragged breath and the distant rustling of the trees. That's when I heard it again, the whisper. It was soft, barely audible at first, but it grew louder, clearer. A voice, though not human, speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words echoed around me, coming from every direction. I could feel the temperature drop even more. The air seemed thick, almost suffocating. I realized with a terrible certainty that I wasn't alone. The forest had become alive with something ancient, something malevolent. I ran. I don't remember how I got back to the ranger station. My mind was a blur, and every time I closed my eyes, I could see that face, or the lack of one. The thing I saw in the woods was still out there, waiting. It wasn't human. It wasn't even a ghost. It was something far worse, something that had been lying dormant in the woods for far too long. The next morning, I went to the area where I'd seen it, hoping it had all been a bad dream. But there was no sign of the creature. No disturbed ground, no broken branches. It was as if it had never happened. But I know what I saw. I couldn't stay at Timber Ridge after that. I took a leave of absence for a few weeks, hoping the fear would fade. But every time I went back into the woods, I felt its presence, that sense of being watched, that unnatural stillness. I wasn't the only one who'd seen things. Another ranger, Thomas, told me that a long time ago, there had been reports of strange occurrences near the old trail by the lake. Voices, shadows in the trees, people feeling like something was watching them. Thomas said his grandfather had worked at Timber Ridge when he was young and had warned him about something that haunted the woods, something that had been there for centuries. But no one ever spoke of it openly, not to the public, not even to the other rangers. Maybe they were afraid, or maybe they just didn't want to acknowledge that something dark had been there long before any of us had set foot in the park. They told me it was best to leave it alone, just forget about it. But I couldn't. I couldn't shake the memory of that thing, whatever it was, and I couldn't forget the whispering voice that followed me, no matter how far I ran. That place, Timber Ridge, isn't just haunted by ghosts. It's haunted by something else, something far darker than I could have ever imagined. And now, whenever I close my eyes, I hear that voice again, calling from the shadows of the trees.
Next story.
I never believed in ghost stories. Not until that night at the old ranger station. It was supposed to be a simple shift, just me, the dark forest, and the usual quiet of the park. I had been assigned to the remote station at Hawthorne Ridge for a few weeks, doing my rounds and keeping an eye on the few campers that ventured into this part of the park. Most of them were gone by the end of September, leaving the park eerily empty. And the truth was, I liked the solitude. It gave me time to clear my head and get away from the noise of my city life. But that evening, something felt off. I had arrived at the station after dark, the usual routine, check the logbooks, make sure the radios were working, and prepare for the night shift. But when I stepped inside the main cabin, I noticed something strange. The air was thick, almost as if it had been trapped in there for years. A damp, musty smell hung in the air, more pungent than it should have been, and there, lying on the counter, was an old journal. It wasn't one of the newer ones the Rangers used. This was worn, its cover faded and frayed, the pages yellowed with age. I figured it was just another relic of some old Ranger's notes, but I had no idea what I was about to uncover. I opened it up, flipping through the pages. It was filled with handwritten observations, many of them about strange occurrences around the station. The early entries talked about minor things, unexplained noises at night, strange figures seen out of the corner of the eye, and the occasional bizarre wildlife behavior. But as I read further, the entries became more frantic. One entry stood out. It started a week ago. I hear scratching at the windows. When I look, there's nothing there, but I can feel eyes on me. I don't think I'm alone. Something is watching. I closed the book for a moment, uneasy, but it was late and the station was empty. I had a job to do, so I shook off the feeling and went outside to check the perimeter of the cabin. The forest surrounding the station was dense, thick with trees and undergrowth. The moon was hidden behind clouds, casting only shadows in the clearing. Everything was still, too still. As I was walking around the back of the station, I heard something, a faint scratching sound like claws scraping against wood. My breath caught in my throat, but I tried to remain calm. It must have been an animal, a raccoon or something similar. But then I heard it again, this time louder, more deliberate. I turned toward the cabin, but before I could move, a chill swept over me, and I felt it. The feeling of being watched. I wasn't alone, and I wasn't just imagining it. A shadow moved near the far corner of the station. It was too large to be a small animal, and the movement was too deliberate. I froze, trying to make out what it was. The shadow shifted, and I could hear the faint sound of breathing, deep and ragged. My heart began to race. My mind screamed for me to run, to get back inside the cabin and lock the door, but my body refused to move. I could feel the darkness closing in around me, a presence that made every instinct in my body scream danger. That's when I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the dark. It wasn't a person, at least not anymore. The figure was hunched over, its form twisted and unnaturally long. Its limbs were stretched too far, its skin pale and almost translucent, hanging loosely from its body like it was barely clinging to life. It didn't have a face, not really, just dark hollows where eyes should have been. It was as though the thing had been drained of all humanity, and what remained was something wrong, something not quite of this world. I took a step back, the sound of my boots crunching against the gravel, and the creature's head snapped toward me. It didn't move immediately, but I could feel it staring, watching, waiting. My pulse thundered in my ears as I turned and ran. I didn't even look back to see if it was following me. I just ran, sprinting as fast as I could toward the station. When I reached the door, I shoved it open, locking it behind me with trembling hands. I grabbed the radio, my fingers slipping as I tried to call for help, but there was no response. The static was deafening. The air inside the cabin felt thick, almost suffocating. My heart was racing and my mind was spinning, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. I couldn't. There was no logical explanation. The scratching at the windows started again, only this time it was louder, closer. The creature was outside. It was trying to get in. I could hear its ragged breath, its movements slow but deliberate, like it was savoring the fear it was causing. I backed away from the window, gripping the radio tightly, hoping that someone, anyone, would answer. But the static was the only thing that filled the room, loud and oppressive. Then a voice came through, low and distorted. "Don't look outside." I froze. The voice was familiar. It was one of the senior rangers, a man named Grant, who had warned me about the station. He had told me about the stories, the strange things that had happened there, how no ranger had ever lasted a full year without experiencing something terrifying. "It's not just one," the voice continued. "There are more, and they're coming for you." I didn't know what to say. I wanted to scream, to demand an explanation, but I couldn't form the words. The cabin creaked, and I could hear the heavy steps of something outside, circling the building. The air grew colder. My breath came in short, panicked bursts, and then I heard the whispers. They were coming from inside the cabin. It was impossible, but the whispers were there, low, unintelligible, as though voices from another world were speaking to me from the walls. I could feel them crawling under my skin, their presence pressing in from every direction. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling as I tried to make sense of it all. Was I losing my mind? The radio crackled again. "You have to leave. Get out now." I didn't need any more convincing. I grabbed my bag, rushed to the door, and flung it open. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. I ran, not stopping, not looking back. As I ran toward the road, I could hear the creature behind me, its slow, deliberate footsteps following me from the darkness. But when I reached the main road, I stopped. The creature was gone. I didn't look back. I didn't return to the ranger station that night, or any night after. I still don't know what I saw out there at Hawthorne Ridge. Maybe it was a ghost. Maybe it was something else, something darker, something older. All I know is that I left that place behind, and I'll never go back.